the symbol that every country on earth associates with America. Freedom, the frontier, the man who bows to nothing and nobody. Except the word American is not even American. America comes from Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian explorer from Florence, named after him by a German cartographer called Martin Waldseemüller in 1507, the very word that defines this nation, that gets printed on passports and stamped on military uniforms and sung about in every anthem. That word is European, the name of a continent given by a German to honour an Italian. That is where this starts, because nothing about what people call American is as American as they think it is. The cowboy himself, that grandfather of every Western movie ever made, that figure who sits at the absolute centre of what America believes about itself, where did he come from? His grandfather was born in County Cork or in a village 2 hours outside Hamburg or in the English Midlands or the Scottish Highlands. He crossed the Atlantic in conditions that killed roughly a third of the people who attempted them. He arrived with nothing. Built something from nothing. His son pushed west. His grandson was the man on the horse. That is not a uniquely American story. That is a European story that happened to take place on American soil. The word cowboy itself entered the English language in 1725 as a direct translation of vaquero, the Spanish word for a man who manages cattle on horseback. But the men who made the cowboy what the world knows, the men on the open plains of Texas and Kansas and Wyoming in the 1860s and 1870s, the men whose image became the most recognized symbol of American identity on earth, those men were the sons and grandsons of European settlers. John Chisholm, one of the most significant cattle ranchers in the history of the American West, was of English descent. Charles Goodnight, who pioneered the Goodnight-loving trail, was of English descent. Jesse Chisholm, after whom the Chisholm Trail is named, was half Scottish. These are not marginal details, they are the main story. The same European spirit, the one that looked at a horizon and went toward it regardless of what was on the other side, is the most important thing to understand about America, because it did not begin in America. It is thousands of years old. Before America, there was Europe, and before the Europe that built America, there was something older, something that ran through the blood of every man who ever looked at the horizon and decided to cross it. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were the descendants of Vikings, Norsemen who had settled in northern France a century earlier, taken French wives, learned French, built cathedrals, and then, still carrying the Viking fire in their blood, crossed the Channel with 8,000 men and took one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe in a single afternoon. William the Conqueror did not have a vast empire behind him. He had ships, men, and the specific quality that European warriors have carried since the beginning of recorded history, the absolute refusal to accept a situation as fixed. The Saxons they defeated were the same blood. Germanic tribes who had crossed the North Sea centuries earlier, pushed the native Britons into Wales and Cornwall, built a kingdom out of nothing, and produced a legal tradition that would eventually become the foundation of American law. The Magna Carta that King John signed in 1215 under pressure from Saxon barons is the direct ancestor of the American Bill of Rights. The rights it established, and that no free man could be imprisoned without the judgment of his peers, that justice could not be sold or denied, travelled from that field at Runnymede to Philadelphia in 1787 and became the framework of the most powerful republic on earth. These men were not peaceful. They were not soft. They were the product of 1,000 years of European warfare, expansion and civilization building that produced simultaneously the most beautiful art in human history and the most effective fighting forces the world had ever seen. The same civilization that built Chartres Cathedral built the longbow that destroyed the French cavalry at Agincourt. The same tradition that produced Dante and Shakespeare produced the naval tactics that made European ships dominant on every ocean on Earth. The Vikings left Scandinavia not because they had to. Nobody was driving them out. They left because the blood told them to. Because sitting still was not in their nature. Because the horizon existed and they needed to know what was on the other side of it. Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for manslaughter and went west. He found Greenland. His son Leif Erikson went further west still and found a coast he called Vinland. This was approximately 1000 AD. It was 5 centuries before Columbus, 6 centuries before the Mayflower. The European drive toward the west is not a modern phenomenon. It is ancient. It is the oldest expression of what European men have always done when given the opportunity. The Norsemen were not alone. The Normans took England in 1066 and then took southern Italy and Sicily within a generation. The same bloodline, the same drive. Men who looked at a map and asked what was available, not what was permitted. Norman knights fought in the Crusades, establishing European kingdoms in the Levant that lasted nearly 2 centuries. They were not sent by any empire. They went because that is what European men of that era did. They identified territory, they moved, they built. The German knights who pushed east into the Baltic in the 13th century were the same expression. The Teutonic knights carved a state out of pagan Prussia through decades of warfare, and then built cities, legal codes, and agricultural systems that transformed the region within a generation. Not because they were ordered to, because that was the nature of the European warrior when given land and time. He builds. The Spanish conquistadors who went to the Americas in the 16th century, love them or hate them, accept the full historical complexity of what they did, were the expression of this same drive at its most extreme. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519 with 508 soldiers, 16 horses and 11 boats. He then burned the boats so his men could not retreat. He marched into the heart of the Aztec Empire and conquered it. Not because he had superior numbers, he had the opposite. He had the specific quality that made European men the dominant civilizational force on Earth for 5 centuries. The complete absence of the option of giving up. The English sailor Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580. He was the second man to complete the circumnavigation. He did it in a ship called the Golden Hind, with a crew of roughly 80 men, losing 4 of his 5 vessels en route, fighting Spanish naval forces in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and returning to Plymouth with enough plundered Spanish gold to pay off the entire national debt of England. Queen Elizabeth came aboard and knighted him on the deck of his own ship. That is what the European warrior tradition looks like when it is operating at full capacity. And it is this tradition, this specific, ancient, identifiable European quality of conquest, exploration, and civilization building, that crossed the Atlantic and became America. Cicero, the Roman statesman who governed the Republic in its final generation, wrote something 2,000 years ago that this video is built around. He wrote, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. For what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history? The people who want European Americans to forget their history understand this perfectly. A man who does not know where he comes from does not know what he is capable of, does not know what his people have built, does not know what he has a right to claim as his inheritance. A man cut off from his history is exactly what Cicero said, a child, permanently a child, manageable, directable, exploitable. Now the settlement, because before you can understand what was taken, you need to understand what was built. When the land that would become America was first encountered by European explorers, it was not empty. It was populated by hundreds of distinct tribal nations who had been there for thousands of years, and those nations were fighting each other with the same ferocity and the same territorial ambition that European peoples brought when they arrived. The Iroquois Confederacy in the northeast had been at war with the Huron for generations. The Plains tribes raided each other's villages and stole each other's horses and took each other's women and children as captives as a matter of standard practice. The Aztec Empire that Cortés found in Mexico was built on the conquest and subjugation of dozens of surrounding peoples and sustained itself through the ritual sacrifice of tens of thousands of captives per year. This is not a comfortable thing to say in the current cultural climate. It is what the historical record documents. The European arrival in the Americas was not the introduction of conquest into a peaceful continent. It was the arrival of a more technologically advanced form of the same process that had been running on that continent for millennia. The strong taking from the weak, the expanding powers absorbing the smaller peoples around them, the continuous cycle of territorial acquisition through force. This is what the historical record shows. The specific tragedy of what happened to indigenous American populations, the diseases that killed between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact population, the systematic displacement from ancestral lands, the cultural destruction, was real and catastrophic. But it was not the introduction of violence into a peaceful world. It was a catastrophic collision between 2 civilizations in which one possessed decisive technological advantages. The first permanent English settlement in what would become the United States was established at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. 104 men, they arrived in May. By January of the following year, 38 of them were still alive. Disease, starvation, conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy, the brutal Virginia winter. 66 men dead in 8 months. The survivors sent word back to England and more came. This is not a story of easy conquest. This is a story of European men dying in enormous numbers in an alien environment, and the ones who survived staying anyway and sending for reinforcements. The specific stubbornness of that decision, to stay and send for more, rather than to turn around and go home, is the foundation of the United States of America. By the time the first American census was taken in 1790, the European American population of the new republic had its roots in a century and a half of this. Generation after generation of men and women who had crossed an ocean in ships that killed roughly a third of the people who attempted them, who had buried children in ground that had no name yet, who had built farms and towns and eventually cities out of wilderness. The census found approximately 3.2 million European Americans. Around 60% were of English and Welsh descent. Around 15% were Scottish and Scots-Irish. 9% were German. Smaller populations of Dutch, French and Swedish completed the picture. When you add the British groups together, over 90% of the founding European American population came from the British Isles and Northern Europe. These were not random people, they were the self-selected products of the most demanding immigration process in human history up to that point. The people who crossed the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th centuries were not the comfortable people. The comfortable people stayed in England, in Germany, in Scotland, in Ireland. The people who got on the ships were the ones who had already decided that whatever was on the other side of the horizon was worth the risk of dying to reach it. The Germans who settled Pennsylvania from the 1680s onward came primarily from the Rhine Valley and from regions that had been devastated by the 30 Years' War. By the time the 1790 census was taken, German Americans were so numerous in Pennsylvania that they outnumbered every other group in the state. The Pennsylvania Dutch, who are German, not Dutch, the word Deutsch being mistranslated, built some of the most productive farmland in North America in a generation. The Scots-Irish, who came from Ulster from the early 18th century, pushed straight to the frontier. They settled the Appalachian Highlands and the backcountry of Virginia and the Carolinas. They produced Andrew Jackson, the son of Scots-Irish immigrants from County Antrim, and the specific warrior tradition of the American South and West that ran from the Revolutionary War into the 20th century. John Jay, who became the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court and was one of the 3 authors of the Federalist Papers, wrote something in 1787 that every American should know. He wrote in Federalist No. 2, "Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. This country and this people seem to have been made for each other." John Jay, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, writing in the founding document of American constitutional philosophy, describing the American people as a people descended from the same ancestors. That is not a modern revisionist claim. That is one of the founding fathers describing his own country in his own words. New York City was founded in 1624 by Dutch settlers and named New Amsterdam. When the English took it from the Dutch in 1664, they renamed it New York. The city that grew from that foundation over the following 2.5 centuries became the largest and most powerful city in the Western Hemisphere. It was built by European hands at every stage. In 1940, the European American population of New York City was 92% of the total. 92%. That is the New York City that built the Empire State Building, that produced the music of the jazz clubs and the manufacturing base of Brooklyn and the financial system of Wall Street. A European city on American soil, its food was European, its architecture was European, its legal system was English, its dominant language was English with significant pockets of Italian, German, Dutch and Irish. By the 2020 United States Census, the European American population of New York City was 30.9%, and this is a fact, a documented census fact. The question is whether European Americans know what they are, whether they understand that the city they inhabit was built by their specific ancestors out of the specific European tradition those ancestors carried. Chicago was built the same way. German and Scandinavian immigrants flooded into Illinois and Wisconsin in the mid-19th century. Irish immigrants built the Illinois and Michigan Canal with picks and shovels in conditions that killed thousands of them. The Union Pacific Railroad was built primarily by Irish Americans, averaging 2 miles of new track per day. The meatpacking industry that made Chicago the industrial center of the Midwest was built on the labor of German and Scandinavian workers, who came with specific industrial skills developed over generations in European workshops. Boston was an English city in everything but name for its first 2 centuries, founded by Puritans from East Anglia in 1630. Harvard College was founded there in 1636, 6 years after the city itself, modelled directly on the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The intellectual tradition that produced the American Revolution, that produced John Adams and Samuel Adams and John Hancock, was the English Puritan tradition transplanted to New England and given 3 generations to mature. Philadelphia was founded by William Penn in 1682 as a Quaker colony. Penn was English. The city he built attracted Germans, Welsh, Irish, and Scots-Irish in addition to the English Quaker core. The framework he established of religious tolerance and written governance was a specifically English contribution to American political thought that influenced the Constitution directly. The specific founding facts of American civilization are not complicated. The Constitution is English common law, the language is English, the legal system is English, the philosophical foundations draw from John Locke, born in Somerset in 1632, and from the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers Adam Smith and David Hume. The architecture of Washington, D.C. is classical European. The founding fathers were overwhelmingly British. George Washington was of English ancestry. Thomas Jefferson was of English and Welsh ancestry. John Adams was English. Alexander Hamilton was Scottish through his father. Benjamin Franklin's family came from Northamptonshire. America is not a departure from European civilization. America is European civilization's greatest project, built by Europeans, named by Europeans, governed by European law, fought for with European blood. Here is something that almost nobody discusses directly about the American Revolution. The men who fought against the British in 1775 and 1776 were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, British themselves. The soldiers of the Continental Army were English Americans, Scots, Irish Americans, Welsh Americans, German Americans who had been in the colonies for 1 or 2 generations at most. George Washington, the commanding general of the American forces, was a Virginia planter of English descent, whose family had been in the colonies for less than a century. The men they were fighting and the redcoats of the British Army were in many cases their relatives, not metaphorically, literally. The Scots-Irish communities of the Appalachian backcountry had cousins in Ulster. The English-American communities of New England had grandparents who had been born in the same English counties as the soldiers being sent to suppress them. The German-American communities of Pennsylvania had relatives in the German states, from which the British Crown was hiring Hessian mercenaries to fight the colonists. The American Revolution was in significant part a family argument, a dispute between European people about how European political principles, specifically the English tradition of representative government and individual rights that ran from Magna Carta through the English Civil War to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, should be applied on a new continent. The colonists were not rejecting European civilization, they were insisting on their full rights as Europeans. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and it draws almost entirely from European philosophical sources. John Locke's 2 treatises of government, published in 1689, provides the framework for the natural rights argument. The social contract theory of the French philosopher Montesquieu informs the separation of powers. The classical republicanism of ancient Rome and Greece provides the historical precedent. Jefferson was not inventing a new philosophy. He was applying the best of European political thought to the specific circumstances of the American colonies. The Constitution that followed 11 years later is the same. James Madison, who is called the father of the Constitution, had studied Roman constitutional history, English common law, and the political thought of the Scottish Enlightenment in preparation for writing it. The system of checks and balances, the separation of powers, the protection of individual rights against the state, all of these draw from European intellectual traditions that had been developing for centuries before any European had set foot in North America. The irony of the American Revolution is that the people who fought it to assert their European rights created a country that would, within 2 centuries, begin to forget that those rights were European in origin. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. At that moment, German Americans were the largest non-British European ethnic group in the United States, 8 to 9 million people. There were German language newspapers in every major American city, German language schools, German cultural societies, German churches, German choral societies, a cultural infrastructure that had been building for 2 centuries. They were one of the most cohesive ethnic communities in America. When the declaration of war was made, significant numbers of those 8 to 9 million German Americans had relatives in Germany, cousins, uncles, brothers who had gone back. The communities of European Americans in the United States were not separated from Europe by centuries of distance in 1917. They were separated by 1 or 2 generations at most. The pressure on German Americans to prove their loyalty was immediate and total. German language newspapers were shut down overnight or forced to switch to English. German language instruction was eliminated from public schools in multiple states simultaneously. In Iowa, the governor issued an order making it illegal to speak German in public. Streets named after German figures were renamed. German cultural societies disbanded or rebranded. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. Frankfurt became hot dog. Hamburg steak became Salisbury steak. Beethoven and Bach were removed from concert programs across the country. Individual German Americans faced violence and harassment. A German-American man in Illinois, named Robert Prager, was lynched by a mob in April 1918, accused without any evidence of being a spy, and the 12 men charged with his murder were acquitted by a jury. The Department of Justice required all German-born male residents over 14 to register as enemy aliens. The result was the fastest and most complete cultural assimilation of a major ethnic group in American history. Within a generation, the German-American community, which had maintained its language, its institutions, its cultural distinctiveness for 2 centuries, had dissolved almost entirely into a generic American identity. The German language press, which had been one of the largest outside Germany, was essentially gone. The schools were gone, the cultural societies were gone, the language was gone from the next generation. This was the first great severance, European Americans being forced to shed their specific European identities under the pressure of war with Europe. Then, the Second World War. And here, the story of European blood divided against itself reaches its most extreme and rarely discussed expression. At the Battle of Normandy in June 1944, American soldiers landed on the beaches of northern France and fought German soldiers in some of the most intense combat of the entire war. On Omaha Beach alone, approximately 2,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded on the first day. The men dying on both sides of that beach were predominantly of European descent. The American soldiers were English Americans, Irish Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, Scandinavian Americans, Dutch Americans. The German soldiers were German, Austrian, Dutch, Flemish, Danish, European men conscripted or enlisted from across occupied Europe. The demographic reality of recent European immigration meant that, in June 1944, there were almost certainly American soldiers on Omaha Beach who had German-born fathers. There were German soldiers in the defensive positions above the beach who had American-born relatives. The bloodlines of Europe and America had been so recently and so completely intertwined that the war was, in a very literal sense, European Americans killing European Europeans. This is not a comfortable thing to say. It is the historical fact, and the specific case of Baldur von Schirach makes it impossible to ignore. Von Schirach was the leader of the Hitler Youth from 1931 to 1940. He built it from a small organization into one of 6 million members by 1936. He was later convicted at the Nuremberg trials of crimes against humanity for ordering the deportation of 65,000 Viennese people to the death camps in occupied Poland. He served his full 20-year sentence and died in 1974. His mother was American. Her name was Emma Middleton Linna-Tillu. She was a direct descendant of Arthur Middleton, one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence. Von Schirach's ancestry on his mother's side included 2 signatories of the American founding document. The man who built the machinery of Nazi youth indoctrination had American founding father blood in his veins. This is not offered as a moral equivalence or an excuse. He did what he did, and he was convicted for it. It is offered as a demonstration of how completely the bloodlines of Europe and America were intertwined in the early 20th century. The families of ordinary German Americans had cousins in Germany. Their cousins had cousins in America. The Second World War was European civilization destroying itself from inside, using the Atlantic Ocean as the dividing line between 2 halves of the same civilizational tree. When American soldiers killed German soldiers at Normandy, they could have shared DNA. That is not an exaggeration. Given the documented patterns of immigration and the timelines involved, it is a documented demographic probability. European blood on both sides of the beach, European civilization consuming itself in the worst war in human history, and the ideological framework that was built around that war in the decades that followed required the erasure of this specific truth. The narrative of the good war, the clean moral story of American democracy defeating European fascism, required that the American soldiers at Normandy be simply American, not German American or Irish American or English American, not Europeans fighting their cousins, Americans, a new people, a universal people, a people with no specific European identity to complicate the narrative. And so the hyphen went, and with it went the specific knowledge of where each community had come from. The process did not stop with the wars. In 1965, the United States Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act. This act abolished the national origins quota system that had been in place since 1924, a system that had explicitly prioritized immigration from Northern and Western Europe. Since its passage, nearly 39 million immigrants have arrived in the United States. The foreign-born share of the American population has gone from 5% in 1965 to nearly 15% in 2024. According to Pew Research, the share of the American population that is non-Hispanic European American has dropped from over 83% in 1970 to approximately 56% in 2024. By 2055, Pew projects European Americans will be below 50% of the total population, below majority for the first time in American history. California has already crossed that line. Texas has already crossed it. In New York City, European Americans are 30.9% of the population. In Los Angeles, they are 28%. These are not projections. These are current census figures. European Americans are already a minority in many of the major cities that European Americans built. This is a documented fact stated as a documented fact, not a moral judgment, not an argument. The census data exists and it says what it says. Alongside the demographic transformation, the cultural transformation has proceeded in parallel. In the school curriculum, the specific achievements of European civilization have been progressively de-emphasized in favor of a focus on its crimes. The Founding Fathers are presented primarily through the lens of their slaveholding. The conquest of the frontier is presented primarily as dispossession. Columbus has been stripped of his significance as an explorer and reconstructed primarily as a symbol of conquest. The men who built the cities and the railroads and the constitutional framework of the most powerful republic on earth appear in the curriculum overwhelmingly as wrongdoers rather than builders. The effect on young European Americans is measurable. A generation that has been taught that its heritage is primarily a catalogue of crimes will either accept that framing passively, which produces a diffuse guilt about its own existence that is politically useful to people who benefit from European American passivity, or it will reject the framing entirely and go looking for something the curriculum has not provided, which is exactly what is happening. Millions of young European Americans are watching Viking documentaries and World War II content and medieval European history on YouTube and TikTok. They are reaching back towards something they were never properly taught but can still feel. Looking for proof that the people they come from were not only perpetrators, looking for the thing that was taken from them. The DNA test moment on TikTok is the same impulse at its most basic level. An American holds up their phone, reads the results, 43% English, 28% German, 17% Irish, 8% Scottish, and they look genuinely surprised. The comment sections fill immediately. Same. My grandmother was from Cork, my great-grandfather came through Ellis Island, I had no idea I was this much German. They should not be surprised. Every one of those numbers is exactly what the historical record predicts. The first American census in 1790 would have produced very similar percentages for most American families of European descent. But the fact that they are surprised and the fact that a generation of Americans in 2026 needed a laboratory to tell them they are European is one of the most significant cultural facts of this moment. It tells you precisely how thoroughly the thread was cut. The information was not lost through accident or time, it was removed, replaced with a version of American identity that had no specific European content. There is a parallel crisis happening in the American economy right now that connects directly to the identity question. The H-1B visa program allows American companies to hire skilled workers from abroad in fields where they claim domestic shortages. In 2023, approximately 65% of H-1B visas went to workers from India. In 2024, that figure was consistent. The technology sector is the largest user of the program by a significant margin. The Economic Policy Institute has documented that H-1B workers are routinely paid below market rates for equivalent positions. A 2020 report found that the majority of H-1B positions certified by the Department of Labour were at wages in the bottom two wage levels, wages below the median for the occupation in the relevant market. Companies are using the visa program not to fill genuine skills gaps, but to undercut the wages of domestic workers and to create a workforce that is structurally dependent on employer approval. An H-1B worker who loses their job, loses their visa, and must leave the country. They are, by the structure of the program, more compliant than a citizen who has unconditional residence rights. The people paying the price for this are disproportionately young European Americans with engineering and computer science degrees who are applying for entry-level positions at technology companies and finding themselves competing against imported labour willing to work for less. The same young men who were told to study hard, get the degree, work in technology, build the future of America, are discovering that the companies building that future have decided they are not the cheapest available option. Elon Musk, one of the most prominent technology figures in America, and someone with significant influence over the current administration, stated publicly in late 2024 that he could not find enough talented Americans and that the solution was to import talent from elsewhere. He was defending the H-1B program against criticism from within the MAGA movement, from people who had voted for Trump specifically because of America First economic promises, and who found the open door to foreign labour imports inconsistent with those promises. The irony is almost too pointed to state directly. The country that was built by European men doing the hardest work in the worst conditions in order to create something for their descendants is now telling those descendants that they are not competitive enough to be hired at their own companies. The railroads that Irish Americans built 2 miles a day through the Rocky Mountains, the steel mills that German and Scandinavian workers built into the industrial spine of the Midwest, the financial system that English-American merchants built in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, the technology industry that European Americans largely created from nothing in the garages and university labs of California, and now the visa program that fills the entry-level positions in that industry with imported workers at below market wages, while the grandchildren of the people who built it are told there is no room. In 2020, Donald Trump stood before the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee and called Israel America's greatest ally. The statement received standing applause from the room and no serious challenge from the mainstream press. It is historically false. Britain and America have fought side by side in every major conflict of the 20th century. The intelligence relationship between the two countries, the Five Eyes alliance, which includes the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, is the deepest and most extensive intelligence partnership anywhere in the world. The legal systems are the same system, the language is the same language, the philosophical foundations of both constitutions draw from the same sources: Locke, Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. When America was attacked on September 11, 2001, Britain invoked Article 5 of the NATO Charter and sent its soldiers to fight alongside Americans in Afghanistan. When Britain needed help in the Falklands in 1982, the United States provided intelligence and logistical support. When America entered the Second World War in December 1941, Britain had already been fighting Germany alone for 2 years. The special relationship between America and Britain is not a phrase invented by politicians. It is the description of a 300-year-old bond between two nations that share the same blood, the same law, the same language, the same philosophical tradition, and the same fundamental political culture. Israel became a state in 1948. The relationship between America and Israel developed primarily from the 1960s onward. It is a real geopolitical relationship with genuine strategic dimensions. But it is 60 years old. The relationship between Britain and America is 300 years old and runs through the blood and the law and the language and the culture of every American whose family came from the British Isles. The British soldier and the American soldier who fought together at Normandy in June 1944 were cousins in the most literal possible sense. Their great-grandparents may have come from the same English villages. Their families had been divided by an ocean for a generation or two. The specific bond between Britain and America is not a diplomatic construction, it is a family relationship, and it has been progressively deprioritized in American foreign policy in favor of relationships that are historically recent and strategically complicated in ways that the British relationship is not. This matters for the broader argument this video is making. When a country loses its sense of where it comes from, it also loses its sense of who its natural family is. America's natural family is Europe. Its closest relative within that family is Britain. The progressive forgetting of European American identity has produced a foreign policy that has drifted away from the relationships that actually matter and toward relationships that serve interests that are not always identical to the interests of ordinary Americans. John Jay wrote in 1787 that the Americans were a people descended from the same ancestors speaking the same language, attached to the same principles of government. He was describing a real historical fact. He was also making an argument that the shared heritage of the American people was one of the country's primary strengths, that the common roots, the European roots, were the foundation on which the Republic stood. That foundation has been progressively undermined, not through the arrival of other peoples, which has happened in every major empire in history and need not be fatal to a civilization's sense of itself, but through the specific project of telling European Americans that their heritage is primarily a source of guilt rather than identity, that to acknowledge their European roots is somehow exclusionary or dangerous, that the proper relationship of European Americans to their own history is apology rather than understanding. The result is visible everywhere in America in 2026. It is visible in the TikTok video of the American who does not know they are 43% English. It is visible in the school curriculum that teaches European American children to understand their heritage primarily as a catalogue of crimes. It is visible in the technology company that cannot find talented Americans because it is not looking for them. It is visible in the foreign policy that calls a 60-year-old alliance more significant than a 300-year-old one. And it is visible in the specific crisis that America is in right now. Trust in American institutions has collapsed from 75% in 1958 to 17% in 2024, according to Pew Research. A war is ongoing in Iran that 60% of Americans oppose, launched without the congressional authorization the Constitution requires. The Epstein files, which implicate the most powerful people in American political and financial life, produced a unanimous Senate vote for transparency and zero arrests. The H-1B program is replacing domestic workers with imported labor while the administration that promised America first defends the program. The demographic transformation that has taken European Americans from 92% of New York City in 1940 to 30.9% in 2020 has occurred without any democratic vote on whether it was the direction the country wanted to go. These things do not happen to a people who know who they are. They happen to a people who have forgotten, a people who have been told so consistently and so insistently that their specific heritage is a source of shame rather than strength, that they have lost the capacity to recognize when their interests are being overridden. The cowboy on the horse at the beginning of this video did not think of himself as a generic American. He knew his grandfather had come from Cork, or from the Rhine Valley, or from the Scottish Highlands. He knew what that meant. He knew what kind of people he came from and what they had been capable of. He carried that knowledge in the way he sat in the saddle, and the way he handled difficulty, and the way he pushed west when the east filled up. That knowledge is still in the bloodlines that the DNA tests are confirming every day on TikTok, reaching back towards something they were never properly taught but can still feel. It is in the specific quality of the American character at its best. The frontier spirit, the refusal to accept limits, the drive outward that comes from somewhere specific, and will not be explained away by a curriculum that has decided the specific place it comes from should be a source of shame. Cicero was right 2,000 years ago. To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. The people who want European Americans to remain children understand this perfectly. A population with no memory of what it has built, with no connection to the tradition it comes from, with no knowledge of its own civilizational inheritance, is a population that can be told anything about itself and believe it. John Jay wrote in 1787 that this country and this people seem to have been made for each other. He was right. America and the European people who built it were made for each other. The continent provided the space, the European spirit provided the drive, the European legal tradition provided the framework, the European philosophical tradition provided the ideas. The result was the most powerful and most prosperous nation in the history of the world. The question now is whether the people who built it will remember what they are before the forgetting becomes permanent. America is European. It was built European, it thinks European, it governs European, its law is European, its language is European. Its founding documents are European in origin and European in content. The man the world knows as the American cowboy was the grandson of a man who was born in Cork or Hamburg or Edinburgh and crossed an ocean to build something in conditions that should have killed him. That man is still here in the bloodlines, in the instincts, in the specific quality of the American character that no curriculum has fully managed to extinguish. It is time European Americans remembered where it came from.